All right. Actually, I was first exposed to, I guess, Afropessimism first through, I was at an anarchist book fair, and one of Wilderson's essays, Gramsci's Black Marks, was packaged as a book, and I saw, I'm like, oh, this is interesting, and I looked at it, and it's like, oh wow, this guy's almost as dense as me, like I just enjoyed the unintimidated, just unapologetic theory. So I'm just like, oh, this is great, and it's dealing with lived black experience. So I picked it up, I read it, and it was just fascinating. He's dealing with Fanon, he's dealing with the Panthers, Black Liberation Army. So I'm like, so there's a confluence of interest that I really just found, just thrilling when I was, reading Wilderson. However, I realized the key to understanding his thought is actually, we have to really understand the normative gaze and what that's all about. And I wrote that up there so I don't have to keep making the same joke about what it's about. Basically, the normative gaze, in the sense of, the normative gaze renders a Western imperialist continuum coherent unto itself through objective violence and miseducation of soul, thus constituting hegemony through the topographical legitimation of coloniality, organizing social consciousness, and sanctioning ahistorical memory towards an unreflective public constellation of values, standards, and narratives that ideologically veil the concerted praxis and systematic imperatives of structural inert global power with a disinterested existential legitimacy as arbitrary circumstances of the real. Now I'm just going to unpack that. When we're talking about the normative gaze is what constitutes the real, but it does this through a topographical coherence. Now, what is a geography? When we think of a map that focuses on geography, it looks at it's a map that kind of outlines the natural landscape. You see the mountains, the rivers, and everything is just outlined there perfectly. When you're dealing with the topography, you're dealing with something that it not only captures the natural landscape, but it focuses on the man-made items as well. There's buildings, there's bridges, but it puts it all together with the natural landscape, so it's presented to you in a certain coherence, as if it was natural. And so that's what we understand is what the normative gaze does. Now, the normative gaze is something we've been struggling with forever as black people. Just with that, you can trace it on back to even Frederick Douglass when he mentioned, what to the slave is the 4th of July. Yeah. It's not just a question of ideology for Douglass, but it's a question of power. I'm saying, in a sense of who has the power to determine and impose their understanding of the real on others. And so the beauty of Afropessimism is also its greatest limitation, because what Afropessimism does by bringing about and problematizing aspects of social death, in relation to slavery and our lived experience even today, it really focuses and gives you a lens from which to understand the normative gaze. But that same thing that makes it beautiful also makes it problematic because it doesn't go beyond the normative gaze. So, and Wilderson himself says that he's trying to develop an accurate grammar of suffering. So I find that excellent. However, I'm trying to develop, an accurate grammar of emancipatory praxis. So there's a confluence in where we begin, but that rapidly changes. And so, for instance, it's one of the things that is really problematic is there's this, it almost, and again, it's a matter, and this is why it's important to understand that, the normative gaze and the topographical coherence of modernity. Because within the context of modernity, I am an object. Exactly. I am not regarded as a human being because I am black. Now, does this mean I'm actually an object? No. But to assert my humanity puts me, in conflict with established power. It's not just a matter in the classic existential sense of, I feel this angst, becoming aware of my freedom, and it's a movement from angst towards authenticity. No, within lived black experience, that movement to authenticity also puts you in line for persecution. And that's why we see, as far as as far as when we look at the black violence, as far as from the cops, when we look at what happened in Flint, Michigan, with it's not just even with George Zimmerman where he got off. I brought that up yesterday in order for in yesterday's panel. So I'll just revisit it. But basically, it was fascinating looking at that case because in order for Zimmerman to be prosecuted, what they had to show was that Trayvon Martin was an object, that he didn't respond as a human being would respond to being assaulted But by the fact that he responded and that he resisted and that he beat that motherfucker's ass like he should have, all of a sudden Zimmerman gets off, because any form of agency asserted as a black man gets read as violence. And that's what Fanon talks about when he says decolonization is always a violent phenomenon. He's not endorsing violence, but he's basically explaining to you within the context of modernity, to assert black subjectivity as human being introduces a certain disequilibrium within that topographical coherence, within the normative gaze. It can't handle that. It can only read it as violence. I mean, I'm just gonna, Sylvia Winters, back in the day, she actually wrote a really brilliant essay after the Rodney King verdict. And I'm just gonna read a part of it to you, because it really, she did her homework. Basically, and this is basically to her colleagues, I guess where she was at the time. She says, "Dear colleagues, you may have heard a radio news report which aired briefly during the days after the jury's acquittal of the policeman in the Rodney King beating case. The report stated that public officials, not even the cops, public officials of the judicial system of Los Angeles routinely use the acronym NHI to refer to any case involving a breach of rights of young black males who belong to the jobless category of the inner city ghettos. NHI means no humans involved."
There it is.
No humans involved. This is not the motherfucking grunts on the street. These are public officials in Los Angeles. So when you want to understand the roots of Afropessimism, you need to look no further than the Western imperialist continuum. However, again, and so it gives you a good language to understand the normative gaze which established power is looking at us. And that's its greatest strength. But again, it's also its greatest weakness, because it doesn't go beyond that. In that process, they cede the category of the human to the normative gaze. And fuck that. What are you talking about? You know, I'm still gonna, you know. And so again, so it's good for understanding an accurate grammar of suffering, but it's not good for resistance. You know, NHI, no humans involved. And you know, it's not like that was a, you know, imagine how long that had to been going on for that to just become part of the culture. And we all know the Los Angeles Police Department is, you know, it's kind of like the paradigm one. That's where the SWAT team started in the battle against the Panthers. And that all of a sudden, now you see that everywhere. So, you know, and this just shows the extent to which we're dealing with racist dehumanization. And so, again, so Afropessimism is great because it kind of is able to flesh out and give you an understanding. When it posits, again, Afropessimism posits what is called a fundamental antagonism, and this is where me and Wilderson part ways. I'll just read some of what he says. But he posits a fundamental antagonism between the human and blackness. But the fundamental antagonism is what I call an exceptional antagonism, again to differentiate, but it's basically between the assertion of black subjectivity and Western imperialist power. So again, he's ceding the category of the human to the oppressor. And you can't do that, again, but again, he's not interested in struggle, at least from my perspective, you know what I'm saying? He's just interested in so that's fine, that's his role, but for someone who's interested in emancipatory praxis, it requires a little bit more. So again, the same thing that makes it, the same reason I enjoy it is also that, I also recognize its limitations. And at the end of the day, none of us have it figured out. But I think it's important to take it seriously as a contribution to discourse and not just dismiss it. Let's engage with him as a theorist. What does he have to say? He's got this right. He doesn't have to, among others. And I'm just dealing with him. I'm not too familiar with some of the others. I haven't had time yet, but definitely, he came across my path, and there's, we have a lot in common, but also that's what made me also, what I enjoyed about it, made me almost, okay, well, how do I distinguish my own existential liberation theory from this shit? You know what I'm saying? And so, but this is Wilderson here, and this is, we'll get into some of the back and forths. Let's see. All right, he basically says, Afropessimism is premised on an iconoclastic claim that blackness is coterminous with slaveness. Blackness is social death, which is to say that there is never a prior meta moment of plenitude, never a moment of equilibrium, never a moment of social life. Blackness as a paradigmatic position, rather than as an ensemble of identities, cultural practices, or anthropological accruement, cannot be disembarkated from slavery. He continues on. The narrative arc of the slave who is black is not at all an arc, but a flat line, what Hortense Spillers calls historical stillness, a flat line that moves from disequilibrium to a moment in the narrative of fake equilibrium, to disequilibrium restored and rearticulated. To put it different, the violence which both elaborates and saturates black life is totalizing, so much so as to make narrative inaccessible to blacks. This is not simply a problem for black people. Again, so he's breaking down the normative gaze, but again, he's ceding too much. What do you mean? You know, and so just keep that in mind. When you know, and again, the beauty of it again is that it does bring into call the gratuitousness of violence that as black people we face. However, I look at it more as objective violence. It's so repetitive, it's so constant that it just becomes kind of, we can't even see it anymore. It just becomes anonymous. And that's why it becomes objective, because it's just an objective fact. Oh, another brother was shot down by police? Okay. It's just part of the sky comes up, there's clouds, another brother was shot by police, the water in Flint is poisoned. Oh, let's go to another movie, another movie comes out. All these things are part of this is what constitutes the real. And the normative gaze constitutes all these things. It's just the natural way, the natural order. Fanon used the example of, and he's talking about the colonialist, how, you have the colonialist is there, he's the human presence, and behind him is the flora, the fauna, and all the people, and so they're just part of the background, the backdrop to the presence of the human, who's the colonizer. You know what I'm saying? So, so the same thing, the natural landscape of modernity is, we're part of the natural landscape. We're the flora, the fauna, the objects that, that make the presence of the human, Western bourgeois subjectivity, white subjectivity, however you want to frame it. What I call the imperial mainstream, that's where, as far as the human, that's where the human exists. And again, Afropessimist does a great job of fleshing that out. So I just want to, with that in mind, I just want to read this passage from a book called The Political Worlds of Slavery and Freedom. But again, it just shows you the incompatibility with Afropessimism and understanding this. How they just explain slavery, social death, and all this stuff like that. Like, it's almost like Frederick Douglass didn't exist. It's almost like, it's like there was no, but not even, again, he's an example, but check this out. This is, let's see, okay, it's talking about the black settlements were therefore subject to regular invasion by slave catchers seeking to kidnap their members, or by white mobs looking to destroy or drive them out. In neither case did the invaders observe a distinction between African Americans who were fugitive and those who were legally free. And in both cases, they usually acted with the sanction or support of white authorities, of police officers, sheriffs, aldermen, judges, and lawyers, especially after the Congress toughened the fugitive slave law in 1850. As a consequence, northern blacks lived in constant fear, whatever their legal status, and like maroons in the southern states or in other parts of the hemisphere, they and their communities had to be perpetually alert, perpetually on guard, perpetually self-protective. After a few years of life in a free state, William Parker, who fled from Maryland to the rural hinterlands of Philadelphia, later recalled, I found my bitter experience that to preserve my stolen liberty, I must pay unremittingly an almost sleepless vigilance. Mm-hmm. And he goes, organized self-defense was crucial. By the mid-1830s, vigilance committees had been established by African Americans in the major cities of the East Coast, taking as their responsibility the harboring of fugitive slaves, as well as the thwarting of slave agents and kidnappers. To those ends, they monitored waterfronts for the arrival of runways or vessels suspected as slavers. They reported on the arrests and abductions of blacks purported to be fugitives. Again, how is this possible within the context of social death? Again, so, and so, again, so it helps you understand the violence of slavery, but it doesn't help you understand the resistance to slavery. And in that same sentence, it helps you understand today the continuing, struggles against Western imperialist power, and the violence. But it doesn't help you understand, how to struggle against it. Unless you take it as, like I did, as they're throwing down the gauntlet, so that means I gotta, my shit's gotta be even tighter now. I gotta, that's basically I took it. And again, so that's why I'm not dismissive. I enjoy it. I like, it's through that, kind of dialectical back and forth. That's how we're gonna figure it out. None of us have it figured out. And so, they're like, yo, this is what's going on. I'm like, all right, I feel you. It's kind of like, and I think that comes from the hip hop culture. It's just like you're in a cipher. Yeah. Everybody's rhyming. You're just bringing, just like coming together. It's just, but this is, this is.
Are you battle rapping?
No doubt. Let's see. All right, yeah. So, wait, I'll just finish this and then I'll pass it on. Let's see. Sure. To those end, they monitored waterfronts. Let's see, they reported. All right. I'll just skip through this. The circulation of information was therefore central to black defense, but so was direct resistance, some of it armed. The vigilance committees did more than spare fugitives to relative safety in the very dangerous environments of the North, where, as one put it, pro-slavery sentiments pervaded. They did more than alert vulnerable blacks to kidnappers who might be lurking. That reminds me of what Malcolm X said, as long as you're south of the Canadian border, you're south. Exactly. And community supporters to rescue blacks from abduction and physically drive off those who threatened. In these endeavors, the vigilance committees, generally headed by African Americans with skills and means, were aided by less formal groups of poor working class blacks who utilized their own networks based in clustered households and work sites. And this is a story of thus self-defense in these black enclaves involved, as it did in Maroons, not only organization and communication, but also fierce confrontations. Consider the episode that has come to be known as the Christiana Riot. In the late summer of 1851, a Maryland slaveholder named Edward Garouche set out to capture 4 of his slaves who had run off 2 years before and were rumored to be in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Garouche first headed by train to Philadelphia, where he obtained warrants under the auspices of the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. With the help of a federal commissioner there, he also received the assistance of a deputy United States Marshal and 2 local policemen. Their concerns about detection suggest that Garouche's posse expected trouble. In fact, the trouble was already brewing. A black Philadelphia tavern keeper and member of a special secret committee, Samuel Wilson, had apparently learned of the warrants issued to Garouche. And he himself headed to Lancaster County to warn black inhabitants and fugitives of what was afoot. So again, you have Western imperialist power making its move, and guess what? It's like, all right, we see you. It's time for us to make our move. He knew whom to find and where to find them. African Americans in and around the village of Christiana, led by the fugitive William Parker, had years earlier formed an organization for mutual protection against slaveholders and kidnappers, and had resolved to prevent any of our brethren being taken back into slavery. They could pass intelligence with great speed, and with the sound of a horn, summon large numbers of the local blacks to come to their aid. By the time the Garouche posse arrived in Christiana and began to move on William Parker's house, somewhere between 75 and 150 black men and women, armed with an assortment of pistols, rifles, scythes, corn cutters, swords, farm tools, were making their way there too. In the ensuing clash, Edward Garouche was shot dead, perhaps by one of his former slaves, and his son was badly wounded. For their part, Parker and 2 of the fugitives quickly fled north to Toronto by way of Rochester, New York, where they were helped by a former Maryland acquaintance of Parker's, Frederick Douglass. So you can't grasp, that episode makes no sense within the context of Afropessimism. You can't even understand what took place there within Afropessimism. But you can understand what Western imperialist power was attempting to impose upon them. Yeah. And that's the thing. There's always been this contestation. Yeah. My objecthood is something they've been trying to repress and establish and make it seem like this is part of the real. But in asserting my subjectivity as as human being, that then creates an issue. But again, I can go on for days, but I want to make sure we're always time.
People died under the brutal colonial rule of the Belgian King Leopold in the Congo alone. It was Belgium, not the Congo, however, that was held up as the victim of horrible atrocities due to German occupation during the war. Behold little Belgium with her pitiable flight, but has the world forgotten Congo? DuBois asked. Racism, he saw, was not only endemic to capitalism and imperialism, but to foreign historical narratives, the stories that got told and those that did not. In the United States, the year before the essay was published, 66 black men and women, mostly in the rural South, were lynched. Another 250 died in urban riots, usually instigated by white vigilante mobs in the North and in the Arkansas Delta. They could have told you, if they were asked, what America was. As we saw the dead dimly through the rifts of battle smoke, and heard faintly the cursings and accusations of blood brothers, we darker men said, this is not Europe gone mad. This is not an aberration, nor insanity. This is Europe. This seeming terrible is the real soul of white culture, Du Bois wrote. Du Bois attended the Versailles Conference that imposed punitive reparations on Germany, crippling its economy and setting the stage for fascism. But to Du Bois, the decision by the victorious European powers to carve up Africa, Indochina, and the Middle East in open disregard for those who lived there was far more criminal. Self-determination, he saw, was only for white Americans and Euro-Americans. He would help convene a Pan-African Congress to protest the renewed subjugation of people of color. The war, Du Bois argued, had nothing to do with democracy and freedom. It was a struggle between imperial powers for the ability to plunder the dark world's wealth and toil, which is also, of course, what our wars in the Middle East are about. Du Bois knew, like Karl Marx, who he greatly admired, that the market economy was designed to make the weak weaker and the strong stronger. The idea that a class of black capitalists and entrepreneurs, or black politicians such as Barack Obama, would somehow rectify social and racial inequality, he said, was absurd. These tokens would serve the capitalist and imperialist system, which Du Bois said had to be overthrown and replaced with socialism. Outcasts are gifted, Du Bois wrote, with a second sight, or what he called a double consciousness. It was, he wrote, in the souls of black folks, the sensation of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others. This gives to outcasts, as it did to many Jewish intellectuals in Nazi Germany, the ability to see behind what Du Bois called the veil. And this sight is imperative not only for the outcasts, but for the nation itself. Those blinded by privilege and the myth of whiteness cannot fathom reality or understand themselves without these outcasts. The more the voices of these outcasts are shut out, the more collective insanity grips the country. By silencing the voices of the oppressed, we ensure our own oppression. I have been in the world, Du Bois said, but not of it. I have seen the human drama from a veiled corner, where all the outer tragedy and comedy have reproduced themselves in microcosms within. From this inner torment of souls, the human scene without has interpreted itself to me in unusual and even illuminating ways. The endemic violence that plagues the country stuns many white elites, but this violence is a daily reality to Iraqis, Afghans, Yemenis, and of course, poor people of color in America. But what on earth is whiteness that one should so desire it, Du Bois asked. Then, always, somehow, someway, silently, but clearly, I am given to understand that whiteness is the ownership of the earth forever and ever. Amen. It is curious to see America, the United States, looking on herself first as a sort of natural peacemaker, then as a moral protagonist in this terrible time, he wrote. No nation is less fitted for this role. For 2 or more centuries, America has marched proudly in the van of human hatred, making bonfires of human flesh and laughing at them hideously, and making the insulting of millions more than a matter of dislike, rather a great religion, a world war cry. Up, white, down, black, to your tents. O white folk, and world war with black and party-colored mongrel beasts. Du Bois saw redemption certainly at the end of his life, not within the bowels of the empire, but in liberation movements outside the empire struggling for freedom. He was arrested for subversive activities in 1951 and had his passport revoked for years. His books were removed from library shelves and eliminated from course curriculums. He was steadfastly defiant. On December 1st, 1961, he formally joined the Communist Party. Soon after, he left the United States to spend the rest of his life in Ghana. Du Bois had a particular characteristic I especially admire. He was rooted in the reality of those he wrote about. He listened. He methodically interviewed poor blacks, whether in the Souls of Black Folks or the Philadelphia Negro, where it is estimated that DuBois spent some 835 hours interviewing some 2,500 households. This gave his work a repertorial authenticity and freshness that eluded most other sociologists and philosophers who pondered the great questions ensconced in their academic enclaves. There comes a time, DuBois wrote, when the oppressed erupt in rage, much like jihadists in the Middle East. Those who never took the time to investigate the long, slow drip of collective humiliation and suffering are shocked. The rage, because it appears to have no context or rationality, is seen as incomprehensible, the product of racial or religious mutations. We see this with the Israeli reaction to the nonviolent protests in Gaza. The press, little more than courtiers to the elites, dutifully certifies this rage as incomprehensible. And because it is incomprehensible, it must be violently crushed. It is difficult to let others see the full psychological meaning of caste segregation, he wrote. It is as though one looking out from a dark cave in a side of an impending mountain sees the world passing and speaks to it, speaks courteously and persuasively, showing them how these entombed souls are hindered in their natural movement, expression, and development. It gradually penetrates the minds of the prisoners that the people passing do not hear, that some thick sheet of invisible but horribly tangible plate glass is between them and the world. They get excited, they talk louder, they gesticulate, they may scream and hurl themselves against the barriers, hardly realizing in their bewilderment that they are screaming in a vacuum, unheard, and that their antics may actually seem funny to those outside looking in. They may even here and there break through in blood and disfigurement and find themselves faced by a horrified, implacable, and quite overwhelming mob of people frightened for their very own existence. DuBois would hardly fare better today than he did a century ago. His radical critique of empire and capitalism would make him even more of a pariah in the academy and on the airwaves. The corporate state, assured they can keep us entranced with their electronic hallucinations and spectacles, along with the inane trivia and gossip that masquerades as news. Do not see him or other radical theorists as a threat. They've orchestrated the post-literate society, the enforced ignorance that perpetuates their power. We have his books. Read them while you still can.